Good evening. My name is Karen Kiefer, and I welcome you on behalf of the Church in the 21st Century Center. This is actually the start of a 4-part programming series. It's an Easter series, and it's entitled Revitalizing Our Church. So we hope we see you at other events. And there are other flyers up on the table that will tell you a little bit more about the upcoming programs. You know, revitalizing our church. We need that now. I've been thinking a lot about Father Bill Neenan. A lot of you in this room might have known him. He was a giant of a Jesuit here at Boston College, and he went home to God almost 5 years ago. And he used to say, "I'm Catholic. God wanted that for me. No one's going to take it away, and I'm not going to give it away." And I love that spirit, because that's everyone, right? Everyone in this room, maybe. He also had some great wisdom about life. He used to say, we have to live our Good Fridays to experience the joy and the wonder of Easter. We're certainly in a Good Friday, for sure, in the church. And we, as hopeful people, want to experience Easter. What does that look like? What does moving forward look like? We'd like this series to engage people in conversations, in ideas, so that we can help move our church forward. We hope through this series that we can take some of these good ideas, some of these important conversations, and mine them, and then put them in our next magazine entitled Revitalizing Our Church. I'm excited tonight to be in conversation with some amazing people. We have Boston College's Jack Dunn, who is our Associate Vice President for University Communications. He's been with the university for over 20 years. He's a father of 4. He is a passionate Catholic, and he fights hard every day for our church and for Boston College. We also have John Allen, who is a friend of Boston College. He's been here on several occasions. We were just recounting that this afternoon. And as one bishop most recently said a couple of weeks ago, if you want to know what's happening in the Catholic Church, read John Allen. He is a prolific writer, and he cares deeply about the church. And we're lucky that he could fly in from Rome to be with us tonight. We also have Father Matt Malone. He, too, is a giant of a Jesuit. He became a Jesuit in 2002 and was the youngest editor-in-chief and president of America Media. He was named in 2012, I believe. He has done an incredible job, and he, too, is a prolific writer, an award-winning writer. So we're so grateful for your minds and your wisdom and your time and your generosity this evening. And we look forward to answering a big question, an overarching question. How does our church become a more effective institution? And how do we restore credibility with the faithful? How do we do that? So, before you answer that big question, one housekeeping issue. When you came in, you received an index card. We're asking if you want to write a question for the panelists, please do so. We're going to collect them over on, you just pass them to the row over to this side, and then we'll collect them probably in 25 minutes discreetly. And then we'll go through and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. Also, Elise, one of my colleagues, would say, if you're on social media, if you know someone on social media, please follow us on the whole series on hashtag BC Revitalize. So anyway, here we go. Jack?
Thank you, Karen.
The floor is yours.
Yeah, we're delighted to have you with us as we take on this series about renewing the Catholic Church in the midst of Lent. Revitalizing Our Church, Ideas from the Catholic Press. With me, as Karen said, is the esteemed Vatican expert and church opinionist, John Allen, who is a great friend of Boston College, has been here many times. And John flew in from Rome, as Karen said, to be with us. And our friend Matt Malone, Jesuit, John is the editor of Crux, of course, and Matt is the president and editor-in-chief of America Media, and was the youngest editor-in-chief ever named to that esteemed publication. So welcome, both of you. Good to have you here at Boston College. Let me begin with you.
I'm also the youngest editor of Crux. I am also the only editor of Crux.
I thought he was going to say the best-looking editor.
Yeah, and they only called me a giant because I'm 6'4".
He is 6'4". So let me begin with a question. I'll start with you, John, because you were there. And the news of late has been the summit for the protection of children in Rome, held in the Vatican in February. You attended. You brought many people from Crux to report on it. Mixed opinions, a lot of frustration. Some people came heartened from the summit. What's your view? Was the summit a success? Was the summit a failure? And if so, how?
Well, despite the fact that you called me an opinionista, I actually try to steer clear of opinion as much as humanly possible. So rather than giving my own verdict, let me give you the case for each. Okay. Let me start by saying that the Vatican is not normally known for its exquisite sense of timing. But in this case, they could not possibly have bookended this event with demonstrations of the need for it any better. I mean, think about the fact this summit was February 21st to the 24th. 1 week before that summit began, you had the laicization of former Cardinal and now former priest Theodore McCarrick. And obviously that was not accidental. The Vatican wanted that case out of the way before the summit began. 2 days after the summit ended, you had the unsealing of the sex abuse conviction of Cardinal George Pell in Australia. And by the way, if you see me checking my phone tonight, it is not because I am bored. It is because right now, as we speak, a judge in Australia is announcing what George Pell's sentence is going to be. And as soon as I know, you will know. And then just a week after the Pell sentencing, you had the sentencing of Cardinal Philippe Barbarin in France. He's the Archbishop of Lyon and the Primate of Gaul, on charges of covering up a case of sexual abuse involving one of his own priests. So on both ends of this thing, you had reminders of what a cancer this crisis has been and continues to be for the Catholic Church, and certainly not just here, but everywhere. Case for success for so let me give you a descriptive observation about the summit. The summit did not produce any breathtaking new policies or initiatives. It did not resolve the long-standing question of how are we going to hold bishops accountable, not just for the crime of sexual abuse, but for the cover-up. And so for people who were expecting that were hoping that this would mark a turning point in terms of action, not just rhetoric, one would have to say the summit did not deliver very much. Now we're going to have to see what happens in terms of the aftermath and the follow-up. But the summit itself did not give us very much. So what's the case for success? Case for success would be that if you are a Catholic from, say, sub-Saharan Africa, or from the Indian subcontinent, or from the Middle East, or from Eastern Europe, or even parts of Latin America, places where the sex abuse crisis, as we all know it, has never happened. Okay, I don't mean by that priests are not sexually abusing children. Human nature being what it is, some small percentage of priests are going to do that no matter where you are. But I mean the crisis in the sense of lawsuits, negative press coverage, high-profile indictments, senior churchmen being compelled to resign over their handling of the crisis. In those parts of the world, this has simply not happened. There isn't a great deal of public conversation or consciousness. And the result of this summit was bishops from those parts of the world, remember, the presidents of their bishops' conferences, for 3 days were given a crash course in what the reality of this crisis has been in the United States and in much of Western Europe, in Australia, Ireland, Canada, and are going home, therefore, with a new understanding of why this is important and what they're supposed to do about it. And I would say from those parts of the world, therefore, you would probably say this summit was worth doing, okay, that it accomplished something important. The bad news, that's the good news. The bad news is that if you are an American Catholic and who has lived with the contours of this crisis for a long time, and you were not really interested in additional statements of intent, additional apologies, additional vows of resolve, but you were looking for the unfinished business of this crisis to be taken across the goal line, and we all know what that unfinished business is. What the Catholic Church has accomplished since the crisis exploded in Boston, now it's hard to believe, but 17 years ago, okay? Since that happened, the Catholic Church has instituted reasonably effective accountability measures for the crime of sexual abuse of a child. In today's church, if you are on the church's payroll and you are accused of the sexual abuse of a minor, you are going to be taken out of ministry immediately. That charge is going to be investigated. If you're a priest and it's found to be credible, you are almost certainly going to be laicized. Okay? And that's the deal, and everyone knows it. And for the most part, that system works. What we do not have is equally effective, strong accountability for the cover-up of sexual abuse. There's now an 800 number to call if you think a priest has sexually abused a child. There is no 800 number to call if you think your bishop has swept it under the rug. And until that kind of accountability is applied, I don't think anybody is going to say that the job is done, and the summit certainly did not accomplish that.
And in your view, whose star rose as a result of the summit in terms of the American episcopacy, and whose star might have fallen?
Yeah, I don't know if that is a particularly useful question, because I don't think that the people who were organizing it or participating in it conceived of the exercise in that way, right? And in part, the question, which is a good one, it reveals, I think, the lens through which Americans very often view these things. And we tend to view them in a particularly American way, right? And from the point of view of the American church. And yet the reality, I often say, I think that the most important question that we face as a people in confronting this reality and the future of the church is ecclesiological. It's the question of what is the church? What do we mean when we say the church? And I think as Americans, we tend to view these events through the prism that we have inherited from our secular culture. So it's a political, or it's a legal, or it's in some other cultural manifestation. And we're also very much a bottom line, results-oriented people, right? That also comes from our culture. And so we want to know, was this a success? Was it not? Whose star rose, whose fell? I think that John is accurate in his analysis, and I would just take it a step further and say, I don't think we can really say whether it was a success or a failure. We certainly can from the peculiarly American point of view that I just described. But I think overall, it's difficult to say, because it is one point, one moment in the church's global reckoning with this sin, with this reality. And because we are talking about sin, we are talking about, we're confronted by a situation where all of the choices are not ideal. And the way that you change the reality is going to be quite messy, and it's going to take quite a bit of time. The thing that I would add to John's analysis also is I do think that there was a shift for the developing world in their perception of this crisis, but I also think that there was a shift among church leaders in Europe, or in Rome, who have at times, I think, felt that, the way that Americans have viewed this crisis, reflected our kind of obsession about sex that comes to us from our culture, or our obsession with politics, or our obsession with legalisms and law and so forth. And I think something shifted there, right? So it wasn't, and not just for the leadership in Africa and India and Asia, the developing world, and so forth, but I also think among the folks who were present from Europe. And that I think is important because, while what we have to offer, it has the advantages and drawbacks of any particular cultural or ecclesial perspective would have. It definitely has advantages, and I think those are going to get a fairer hearing than they might have before.
Can I just jump in and be peculiarly American for a second? Because let me try to answer. Matt, just everything he just said is absolutely correct, of course. But let me try to give you the kind of lowbrow journalist answer to your question. Okay, whose star rose and whose fell? Well, let's remember that for most countries in the world, they only had one bishop there, right? I mean, that was supposed to be the president of the bishops' conference. The United States was actually the only country in the world that had 3 prelates taking part. You had Cardinal Daniel DiNardo of Galveston, Houston, who was the president of our conference. You had Cardinal Blaise Cupich of Chicago, who was a special papal appointee, a member of the organizing committee for the summit. And then you had Cardinal Sean O'Malley there as president of the Pontifical Commission for Minors. And of those 3, I think the takeaway, at least for most of us in the Vatican Press Corps who pay attention to this stuff all the time, would be it was pretty clear that Cupich's stock is going up and O'Malley's is going down. I think that the takeaway, I mean, it was, for one thing, O'Malley wasn't named to the organizing committee, which was a little odd. Now, there are explanations as to why that was the case, but it was still, I think, most people would have interpreted that as a bit of a snub. But more to the point, as recently as a year ago, 18 months ago, it would have been unthinkable for the Vatican to do a summit, particularly with the profile of this thing, about the clerical sexual abuse crisis when Sean O'Malley would not have been absolutely front and center. I mean, he would have been the lead speaker at every press conference. He would be the guy celebrating the penitential liturgy. He would have been the man. And he did not at all play that role this time. He was at one presser, and other than that, he was basically invisible. And it was very clear that Archbishop Charles Scicluna of Malta is now the point man, the front man, for the Vatican's response to the crisis. Cupich, on the other hand, not only was he named to the organizing committee and he presided over the sessions and did his own turn at pressers and so on, but all the signals coming out of this thing was that when the U.S. bishops have the chance to meet in June and resume their deliberations on what they want to do in terms of accountability, that, let's remember, they were set to do that in November. And then we're told by the Vatican, specifically by the Congregation for Bishops, that they had to wait for this summit before they could act, okay? All indications are that the proposal that Cardinal Cupich floated, which is to try to achieve accountability by revitalizing the role of the Metropolitan Archbishop, that's the proposal that the Vatican has green-lighted, and that the other idea that the U.S. Bishops' Conference had toyed with, which was the idea of creating a kind of national, independent, lay-led board to provide that kind of accountability, is not going to fly. So it's another indication that, essentially that Cupich has the support of Pope Francis and his team, and that he has basically become, he's played the role that Cardinal O'Malley did at the beginning. He's the Pope's go-to guy in the United States now.
Matt, there was frustration coming out of the summit because clear guidelines were not established. So there's a credibility issue. What do the bishops need to do to overcome that credibility issue, to regain the trust of the faithful who feel frustrated that they can't come up with effective guidelines to resolve this issue that has dogged the church for decades, and in particular since the revelation of clergy abuse first broke here in Boston in 2001?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's what it has always been for 17 years. And I actually called the Jesuits and asked to apply to become a Jesuit on the day the Spotlight series broke.
Amen.
I actually made the call before I saw the paper. I'm not sure I would have decided otherwise, but it's accountability, it's transparency, it's responsibility, right? One of the things that frustrates me as somebody who loves the church, is is how poorly the U.S. bishops as a group have responded to this crisis, just in terms of their public communications, right? So, for instance, a lot of people will frequently say to me, "Oh, the bishops are a bunch of politicians." And you know what? If they're the worst, they're the worst politicians ever, right? Because I worked in politics, and politicians will get ahead of a story, right? If they have bad news, they're going to get it out before the press does, or before a district attorney puts a gun to their head, right? And so I think there is still a reluctance to be fully transparent, to be and to be frank and honest and upfront about what it is that we're dealing with. So that requires a huge cultural shift, right? The other cultural shift that has to happen is we have to overcome clericalism, right? And clericalism is not the direct active force that we sometimes think it is happening over there. It's much more of a passive phenomenon in which it's very rare that some cleric says, those people shouldn't be in the room. It doesn't occur to them to have those people in the room. Mm. That's how clericalism works. Mm. It doesn't occur to them. And yet what we know from our experience in all of this is who is in the room when the decision is made is absolutely critical. Not because the people who are in the room are necessarily going to care or not care about the welfare of children. We can, I think, presume that most people do. But we all have blind spots. We all have different experiences. We all bring different things to the table. When there are parents in the room and these decisions are being made, you're going to get a different kind of input, right? So overcoming the culture of clericalism, and that also requires us, those among us who are not clerics, you all, to examine how clericalism plays out among the laity, right? And because if we're going to overcome this crisis, then everyone has to claim their rightful place in the church, right? But there is a clericalism that operates among the laity. If I'm standing next to a lay person who's a Eucharistic minister, I'll have 20 people waiting to get communion from me, and no one waiting to get communion from her. That's clericalism. When somebody comes into my office and says, Matt, you're going to have to call them back because they're only going to return a phone call from Father, right? That's clericalism, right? So this is a force that affects all of us. We have to overcome it. And so who is in the room being forthright and transparent about the information, changing the culture, right? And I would say, lastly, all of us throwing ourselves on the mercy of the Lord and begging his forgiveness for what we have done, for what we have failed to do.
John, you wrote, unless the Vatican wants a perpetual war with the press, it needs to become more adept at translating its internal culture for the outside world. The irony, of course, is that you wrote that in 2010. So change has not come. What will it take for the Vatican?
Man, that was only 9 years ago. This is the Vatican we're talking about.
What will it take to get to that?
I mean, you know what the Vatican's working motto is? Talk to me on Wednesday and I'll get back to you in 300 years, right? Look, so your question is, what would it take? Right. Well, first of all, I can tell you what will not do the trick, which is the recent overhaul of the Vatican's communication structures, much ballyhooed. Instead of a staff of 2 people at the top of the Vatican press office, they're now, in theory, 5. No one's entirely clear what they do all day, but they're there. And then, of course, they report to a new superstructure for communications that has a prefect on top of it, and then a veteran Italian journalist who, ironically, told me the other day that he had more access to the Pope when he wasn't working for the Vatican than he does now. So that's obviously not going to do it. Look, what I would think, Matt was talking a moment ago about how this summit may have had some impact on changing European perceptions of the crisis and the American response to it. I mean, I do think another positive outcome of the summit was that there were a lot of prelates who, particularly, again, from cultures that have not experienced the crisis, who heard brother bishops who have talking about the positive role the press had played in forcing the church to confront the reality of what was happening and holding it accountable. And I think that probably had some salutary effect. But, you know, at the end of the day, the Vatican's problem here is that it, not only does it not get ahead of its story in the sense that Matt said, but it operates out of this notion that, that it can set the terms of public conversation about the church, that if it's not ready to answer a question, then it doesn't have to, right? I mean, classic case in point. The Vatican, October 6th to be precise, the Vatican issued a statement saying that Pope Francis had ordered a thorough investigation of the Vatican's archives on the McCarrick case, and that the results of that inquest would be communicated in due course. Okay, October 6th. Here we are, March 12th. Okay, we have not heard word one, okay, about what the results of that inquiry were. And the thing of it is, you know, that silence is actually more deafening than answering the question would be. But I think, you know, the mindset here is that first we make internal decisions about, you know, what we wish to communicate, and then all we need is kind of the hardware to deliver that information, as if the conversation will simply go into hibernation, you know, until they've decided what message they want to project. How do you change that? Well, here's both the bad news and the good news about the Vatican. The bad news is it is an extraordinarily top-down environment in which everyone takes their cues from what the guy in charge wants. Okay, and they can sniff out very quickly what he wants and what he doesn't, and you know, most people there will spend all day, every day trying to deliver whatever it is they perceive that he wants. Okay, now, therefore, if he doesn't want something, that means it just ain't going to happen, no matter what the arguments for it might be. The good news, however, is that if a pope is perceived as wanting something, things can change dramatically. Right? And the proof of this when it comes to communications was the papacy of John Paul II, right? I mean, John Paul believed in communications. He appointed a spokesperson in the form of Joaquin Navarro-Valls who had real access, who was in the room when decisions were being made, when the sausage was being ground, and could speak authoritatively and credibly about it. And for a brief, shining moment, we had a reasonably functional communications environment, you know? So, if we're going to operate on the Thomistic principle that if something has been done, therefore by definition it can be done, I mean, what that would tell us is that it could be done, and the reason it hasn't is that to this point, this particular papacy and the people around this particular pope have not seen it as a priority.
Matt, you knew Father Bill Neenan. Karen invoked Father Neenan at the beginning of this discussion. And we're all here because we love the church and we want to see it renewed and revitalized, particularly during this Lenten season. So Father Neenan always said you need to go through Good Fridays to reach the joy of Easter. How do we as a church get to Easter?
Well, I mean, ultimately, it's not up to us, right? I mean, we have, somebody has won Easter for us already, and he has a name. And he has a church. And I think that that's vitally important to remember because, you know, when I said here at the beginning that I think the question of ecclesiology, what is the church, is the most important question that we face at a fundamental level, it's because, you know, how you answer that question is going to determine whether you stay or go, right? I mean, there either is God, who had a son named Jesus Christ, who won Easter for us, and on that, and through his paschal mystery, founded and instituted a church among human beings, or there isn't, right? And if there is, if this really is God's instrument on earth, then of course we have to stay. And of course we all have to do everything in our power then to bring about the kind of change that is needed. But if it isn't, then why would we ever stay? Why would we care, right? So that, I think, is absolutely important. It's absolutely crucial to start there. But I would say that at a more practical level, in the U.S. church, presenting from what happens in Rome and what happens in the rest of the world, in the U.S. church, there are things that we can do now that we don't have to wait to do. We don't have to have a council. We don't have to have a change in the magisterium's articulation of the church's doctrine. We can do them right now. For example, if who is in the room when the decisions are made matters, then let's get a greater diversity of people in the room when the decisions are made, right? And we should take an inventory of every job in the church in this country and ask ourselves whether it really has to be done by a cleric. And if it doesn't, then it should be done by a layperson with a preference for a woman. We could do that tomorrow, right? We could do that tomorrow. And we can change the people in the room, the culture will follow, right? Rather than sort of sitting back and thinking, how do we begin in this Platonic way to change the culture, right? You change the people who are in the room, right? Or you add to them. You make them more diverse, right? We can do that tomorrow. I mean, there's no reason, why can't a woman lead a dicastery in Rome? We have women who are chancellors of dioceses. Or why couldn't a layperson be the rector of a seminary, or the editor of the diocesan newspaper, or whatever? We really have to ask ourselves that question, because at a practical level, if we continue to govern the church in this country as structurally as if it's 1955, right? Then it's going to be a long way to Easter.
You're both journalists, so let me ask you, you've covered 3 pontificates. What's the role of the Catholic press in the journey towards renewal?
Well, look, let me start by talking about how I see the role of the Catholic press. I have always said that I am a journalist who happens to be Catholic. I am not a Catholic journalist. And what I mean by that is that I don't think the principles of journalism come from the Catechism. I think it's essentially secular enterprise. It's got its own canons. And those canons include things like accuracy and fairness and balance and comprehensiveness in the way that we try to report the news. That said, I do think that journalism done well can be a prolegomena to evangelization and to revitalization of the church, because the problem is one of the things that gets in the way of being able to do anything constructive in the church is that people often carry around in their heads a set of perceptions and often misconceptions about Catholicism that effective journalism could, again, if done well, help clear away. Now, let me tell you why I think the Catholic press right now too often is not playing that role, okay? As Catholics, we talk about being evangelizers of culture. And there are, of course, great shining examples of times when we've done that and done it to great effect. However, I think the opposite is often also true. That is, we are evangelized by our culture. And I think the Catholic press in this country too often is a very faithful reflection of what we see in the media culture writ large, which these days is a kind of extreme and vicious polarization. In which the capacity to have a rational conversation about anything, including how the church can be revitalized, is impeded by the fact that our public spaces have been colonized by this kind of acerbic, vitriolic, nasty sort of attack mode journalism, right? In which the point seems not to be to get to the truth of a matter, but the point seems to be to vanquish one's perceived enemies, right? To outsnark them, right? And this is not a particularly helpful way of doing business. Now, this is true to some extent in press cultures everywhere, but I think it is particularly true in the United States, would be my observation. And of course, in that sense, the church is nothing more than a reflection of the wider social milieu in which we move. I mean, I'll tell you a quick story to illustrate where things have come. When my wife Shannon and I, when we moved back to the United States from Rome, well, first of all, a word about Shannon. Shannon, first of all, is Jewish, so she's not Catholic. And secondly, she's a specific kind of Jew. I think of her as the founder of a fourth strain of American Judaism, which I like to call Obama Messianism. Okay? I mean, she's not waiting for the Savior next year in Jerusalem. She's convinced he came and was in the White House for 8 years. Okay, I mean, every liberal stereotype you can think of, she owns it, right? Like Prius driving, Birkenstock wearing, whale saving, granola crunching, all of it. Okay, so when we moved back to the States, she wanted to move to Denver because that's where her family was, and she wanted to find the bluest neighborhood in Denver she possibly could. So we bought into this, and she actually looked at voting. I didn't even know you could get this information, but do you realize you can look up voting tendencies by zip codes now? They have websites for this. And so she found the neighborhood that had the highest percentage of blue voting in Denver, believe it or not, a place called Stapleton. And there's this little kind of vegetarian eatery there that she will, whenever I'm in town, occasionally drag me to. Let me just say this. If secular liberalism had a chapel, this is where they would go to worship, okay? And, you know, every now and then when she forces me to go, I will amuse myself by, once we get our table and whatever and are seated, I will say things in a loud enough voice that everyone can hear, like, oh, I'll give you the most recent example. I said to her, honey, you know who gets a bad rap? Dick Cheney. There's a really misunderstood guy. To which, you know, she will respond, well, next Saturday, why didn't you just bring your white sheet and burning cross? Okay, this is where we are in America, right? And my wife, she will spend all day doing nothing other than watching MSNBC because it sort of confirms her view of the world, right? And we can all think of examples on the other side of the street too, right? That's where public conversation has come. Now, a serious journalistic enterprise ought constantly to be challenging that, because reality is always far more complex than ideological a prioris, right? It's just, I would say, unfortunately, our press culture generally and our Catholic press culture specifically too often feed that rather than acting as an antidote to it.
Matt, a question for you, if I may. You live in a vibrant Jesuit community in New York. This year at Boston College, 7 students went through the rite of Christian initiation of adults to join the Catholic Church. And every year, students from Boston College make a determination, after meeting often with people like Father Leahy and Father Jack Butler, to pursue religious life, to enter the Jesuits, or to pursue ordination within the Catholic Church. If you're approached by one of those students today, what advice would you give them? Reflective of your own ministry, would you encourage someone to pursue ordination? Would you encourage someone to joyfully pursue the priesthood in the Catholic Church?
Yeah, I would. Actually, just before I answer that question, I just want to comment on something that John said, which I think is, what John said is absolutely true. That, see, in America, we do understand ourselves to be Catholics who happen to be journalists, rather than journalists who happen to be Catholics. But that's also because John and I have different jobs, right? I run a journal of opinion, which is a different kind of journalism. We need to have a distinct point of view when we're providing analysis, and that happens to be Catholic. But I completely agree with your diagnosis of the problem. I mean, if America is some kind of CNN and First Things is Fox and Commonweal is MSNBC, then we have failed. We have failed as a Catholic press if we're not offering something that is different. And yet this is entrenched. This problem, I wrote about it in 2012 when I first came into this job. It has only gotten worse.
Yep.
And you know, every time we all say that we would like to have a diversity of opinions and we'd like to hear different points of view, and yet if I publish somebody who's a conservative, quote unquote, in America, I will hear about it. If I have somebody who's a liberal, I will hear about it, right?
This is why we stopped carrying opinion.
Yeah.
For exactly that reason. Because, when we went independent, which is the polite way of putting it, the more accurate way is when the Boston Globe dumped us, we had thought, well, the balanced way, the kind of non-polarized way to approach opinion would be to find strong conservative voices, strong liberal voices, strong centrist voices, try to give them roughly equal treatment and let them have it out. What we found is that the vast majority of our readers would not give us credit for balance. They would simply seize upon the one piece that drove them crazy and go nuts about it.
Yeah.
So that trying to counteract polarization, we found that we were actually fueling it. So we decided to pull the plug on our opinion content until we figured out a better way of doing it, which, by the way, we still have not.
Right.
Right? That's where we're at.
Yeah, and I'm lucky because our readers do want that kind of balance, but our immediate readers in print and in our digital space, but it's the rest of the world that then comes in.
Yeah.
So, but to answer your more important question, Jack, is yes, I would absolutely encourage someone to pursue certainly to become a Catholic and to pursue a vocation. Because it's, really, now more than ever, right? We need you. And, the advice that I would give is the advice that I was given, which is to learn how to pray and to pray like mad, right? And the process of discernment is to continually ask, what is it that I most deeply desire? Because there cannot be a difference between what we most deeply desire and what God desires for us. And in the realization of where those two meet is our vocation, right? And the church can't. The church it doesn't exist for God. It exists for us to lead to the fullest, to lead to our fullest flourishing. And that is a vocation that's joyfully lived, whatever our vocation is, whether it's as journalists or as parents or as spouses or as clerics or as religious, what have you. People ask me, what do we do to promote vocations? You live them joyfully, right? Because this is the thing that saddens me about the American church. We had a joy deficit going into this crisis, right? And this has only added to it, right? But to find that truth that lies at the heart of us, that comes from the one who is truth, right? That can only bring about joy, and that is needed now more than ever. I don't mean a kind of giddy happiness. I mean the consolation that comes from knowing who we are and helping other people to become what they're called to be.
When you were the Pope's first press conference, you were given the ultimate compliment. It was said of you, this is a journalist who needs no introduction. So if you had the ear of the Holy Father, what advice would you give?
I do not get paid to give advice to the Pope. That's for much smarter guys like Matt. My job is not to try to shape outcomes. My job is to report outcomes as they happen and try to explain where they came from.
But you have a perspective that covers 3 pontificates based on that experience, on that perspective. What would you advise?
This may be my particular purchase on it, but one piece of advice I would give Francis is to rethink his impressions of Americans and of America. It is quite obvious when you watch the internal workings of Francis and his team and the way that they interact with people and decisions are made, that while they do their level best to be fair, there is a kind of fairly palpable low-level ambivalence about the United States that runs through a lot of that. And, I mean, there's no secret where that comes from. I mean, we all know what our national defects are and how they get amplified around the world. But I do think a great deal gets left out of the picture there sometimes. I mean, it's telling, for instance, that the Pope, that Francis has been Pope. Tomorrow, let's remember, will be the 6-year anniversary of his election. So Francis has been Pope for 6 years now. And despite the fact that he seems to give like an interview a week, to this point, he has not given an interview to a single American news outlet. Closest he came was an interview he gave to Phil Puello of Reuters, but Reuters is, of course, based in the UK, right? And I think that's a small example of a kind of bigger thing. And I mean, just as an American, it is sometimes painful for me to watch what I would perceive to be a kind of partial and sometimes excessively ambivalent attitude towards the United States drive policy. I mean, the most recent case in point was, whatever you think about the proposals that the U.S. Bishops' Conference were considering last November to deal with the accountability issue, for them to be told, when no other bishops' conference in the world was given this instruction, they were told they could not act until a summit that was, let's remember, 3 months away at that point. And then that summit comes and goes, does absolutely nothing that bears upon the American discussion. I mean, that's a kind of, I would suggest, a kind of insensitivity to the urgency of the American situation that is puzzling, right? And so I guess, that would be one piece of advice. I think, the other piece of advice, quite honestly, from a communications point of view, this is something that, one of the basic bits of wisdom in crisis management, right? If you think you've got a communications problem, then maybe it's because you actually have a problem, right? In the reality of where we're at with the clerical sex abuse stuff is that the response to that is not fundamentally a messaging problem, right? Because if it were, it would be over, because Pope Francis and his team have said all of the right things. You asked Matt a little bit ago, what would it take to revitalize the church? He ticked off transparency, accountability, and responsibility. Those were the official themes of the summit. One day at the summit was dedicated to each of those 3 themes, okay? So if all it took was saying we're committed to those things, this thing would be over with. Problem is, you actually have to deliver on those commitments. And to date, I think the verdict in the street is that has not happened. So I suppose the other piece of advice right now would be, whatever else you do, figure out this accountability issue. And the accountability not just for the crime, but for the cover-up. Because until that happens, this crisis is going to be hanging around your neck by like an albatross, and it will progressively erode your capacity to get anything else done.
Karen, do you want to take questions, or do I have time for another question? All right, let me ask a question of you, Matt. I was really struck by something you wrote, a most poignant essay in America Magazine titled, "Why Do We Stay in the Church?" It appeared this August. I was moved by it when I read it. You wrote, "Why do I remain a priest? This summer reminded me of something my father, a retired firefighter, said to me after the 9/11 attacks. He said, those firefighters who died in New York, they died running into the building. When there is a fire and lives are at stake, somebody has to run into the building. I stay because the church, in all of its glory and misery, is a building God has made our home here on earth. I remain a priest because someone has to run into the building." What remains as a bedrock of your faith, Matt, that still calls you to run into the building?
I know for a fact I couldn't say it better than I said it there. However well I said it there. I think I really, I believe passionately that in the deepest recesses, in the deepest parts of me, I have faith that the Lord is risen, that he has a name. His name is Jesus Christ. He has a church. This is it. And it's the reason to get out of bed in the morning. You know, I mean, in the end, you know, if it's what they used to call mere Christianity, right? This notion that if Jesus Christ didn't rise from the dead, then why should I rise from my bed, right? Yeah. And one of the wonderful things about being a Jesuit, I would say, is you have this incredibly long formation that robs you of every reason that you had to become a Jesuit, except the one that actually matters, which is the centrality of of Jesus Christ in your life and in the life of the world, right? And what I would say to you asked John, you know, what advice would you give to Pope Francis? Part of the advice that I would give to Pope Francis is stop trying to make everybody a Jesuit, right? Because not everybody is, and that's a good thing, right? That's probably obvious to you that that's a good thing, but it is. It's a good thing, and sometimes I think, you know, he is such a Jesuit, and he thinks like one, and he's steeped in the culture and the spirituality of the exercises, and sometimes that works really, really well. So when he said to the U.S. bishops, you know, you're in a place of desolation. You should not make decisions when you're in desolation. It's Ignatian Spirituality 101. So you need to go on retreat. Okay, that was probably a good idea. You know, the annual airing of grievances at Christmas with the Curia, you know, I know what that kind of admonition is. It's a novice master or a provincial talking to his subjects. I understand that genre of communication, but not everybody does, right?
I could name some guys who do.
Yeah. Right. So, you know, in the end, what's actually more important, I think, than the fact that he is a Jesuit is that he's a religious. Right, and you know, that's often overlooked. You know, that he comes from a place in the life of the church that is not traditionally at its center. Right, every religious order is born in a spirit of reform. You know, this is why. When Protestants disagree with each other, they found new churches. When Catholics disagree, we found new religious orders. It's how we perdure through history and remain one, right? And so by the conclave calling this person who is a member of a religious order to the center of the church and its governance, that the kind of governance you're going to get is going to be very different. Mm-hmm. And so my advice to him would be, okay, you know, try to bring the treasury of Ignatian spirituality to your office, but be cautious about imposing it.
Well said. John, the Catholic Church is the largest private provider of social service care in the world. Mm-hmm. We educate people in the poorest of neighborhoods throughout the country, throughout the world, and we do a remarkable job at doing it. Catholic Church, Tiziana Daring, who's here, professor at PC, was a former president of Catholic Charities. I had the honor to work there too. We were in the poorest neighborhoods. We were the only ones there. Yeah. We did remarkable work. Does the church not get its due through the Catholic press, the secular press, and American society in general? Do we not get a fair shake for the good that we do?
No, of course we don't. Now, I would argue that's probably true of most other institutions too. But no, I mean, you know, obviously, if you just look at coverage patterns of the Catholic Church over the last 2 decades, you know, I mean, it would be no mystery to anyone in this room that probably 80% of the airtime and column inches that have been devoted to the Catholic Church have been driven by scandals of sex or money, and sometimes both, right? I mean, that's just a plain fact. But, you know, I mean, that said, I think anybody who is relying on the media, whether the Catholic or the secular version of it, to define their perceptions of the church is in a bad spot anyway, right? I mean, the truth of it is, my job, 85% of my time probably is taken up one way or the other with responding to stories of scandal, crisis, heartache, and controversy, okay? And those are fully legitimate, and those stories have to be told. And the reason we need a reasonably free press is because often the institution will seek to avoid allowing those stories to be told. And someone needs to step into the gap and answer the questions and address the concerns that people have, right? But the thing of it is, like, you've got to be able to see more than that. I mean, I will tell you that just a bit of historical perspective, first of all. I am profoundly convinced that you could take, one of those wall charts of more than 2,000 years of history, right? I don't know if some of you in this room may be too young to remember this, but in the grade school I went to, we had a Rand McNally wall chart of world history, right? And you could just throw a dart at that, and no matter what period of time it landed in, whether it's the 5th century or the 15th or 5 minutes ago, wouldn't really matter. If you had been alive at that period, you could have made a case for despair about the church, and you could have made a case for hope. It's a question of which one you choose to focus on, right? I mean, the great thing about my job is that I get to move far and wide around the Catholic world all of the time, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And I get to see the reality of the church on the ground in a variety of different settings. Covering the Pope is a bit like joining the Navy. It's not just a job, it's an adventure, right? And so, we travel with the Pope and we see what the reality is in these places. And, how much of that shows through in our reporting, I think we make a good faith effort, but inevitably a great deal of the texture never sees the light of day. But I will tell you for sure that if you're paying attention at the grassroots, there is remarkable positive energy percolating in this church, despite it all. I mean, in about a week's time, I will be in Los Angeles for the annual Religious Ed Congress. And if you've never been there, I would suggest at least once in your life you should go. It's like, for me, it's this annual injection of adrenaline, right? Because, LA, okay, it's not Boston, but it's been hit pretty hard by the sex abuse stuff too. And there's a pretty powerful case for being demoralized there too. But what you get is like 30,000 people coming together in this kind of high-octane environment. I mean, honest to God, it's like going to a Metallic concert, only with liturgical vestments, And you see people who are involved in youth ministry who are doing great things. You see people who are involved in jail ministry who are doing great things. I mean, you see people out in the trenches trying to make parishes come alive, trying to make worship relevant, and who still believe in the possibility of all of that, right? As a journalist, it's always been a source of frustration to me. I think we do a really, really good job of telling the stories of the church at its worst. What we don't often do an equally good job of is telling the stories of the church at its best. But it's there, that's my point. Whether it's on Crux tomorrow or not, that stuff is there.
And there are more of those, aren't there? Yeah, I mean, we just recently launched an initiative at America called The Good News, to highlight those stories, to service them, because much more good happens in the church every day than bad. This is necessarily true, or we wouldn't have survived the last 2,000 years. It's the only institution to survive the fall of the Roman Empire. There's that historical reality. But even more importantly than that, we have the promise of the Lord himself that the gates of hell will not prevail against us, even though it might feel like they are today, right? He didn't say that it wouldn't feel like it is today. He said it wouldn't happen eventually and ultimately, because he would be with us to the end of the age. And those aren't just words. It's the promise of the Lord himself. And, it's important to cling to that. It's important to cling to that.
Are you hopeful for the future, Matt? Are you hopeful for the future?
Yes, because the one who is hope is guiding us.
Amen.
And has promised us. So, you know.
John, I asked Matt if a student approached him regarding a vocation, what would he say? I want to ask the same if a young person said to you, I'd like to be a journalist. What would you say?
Well, first, I would like to ask, are you interested in home ownership, for instance, in your future? Because if so, this might not be the best path. But yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, you know, a lot of people in my business would, you know, sort of moan about the state of journalism today. You know, and I mean, you look around and you understand why, you know. I mean, newsrooms are declining in size. Lots of storied publications are experiencing crises. There is no more job stability. I mean, you know, when I started out in this business 24 years ago now or whatever, I mean, it was the last great flowering of what used to be the career path in journalism, you know? You would start out at a small little local paper, right? Then you would move to a mid-sized paper. And then if you were good, you would be picked up by one of the big papers, right? And then you could live in the same neighborhood with the doctors and lawyers. Now, you couldn't afford as nice a house as they had, but you know, you could be in the same real estate, right? And you could be reasonably secure that that job would still be around and you could finish your career there. Okay, that just doesn't exist anymore. I mean, I'm proof of that. You know, I was hired by one of those big papers, the Boston Globe, and was dumped 18 months later, right? Because the Globe was hemorrhaging money and going through, you know, a distribution crisis and blah, blah, blah. But I think we're living through an enormously creative period in journalism. I think new possibilities are opening up all the time. And I mean, in some ways, Crux is proof of that. I mean, the idea when I started that you could sustain an entire news agency online in the digital realm without having any physical print product at all would have been completely inconceivable, right? But you know, now we do it. The idea that you could sustain a news agency without a central office anyplace, you know, would have been unthinkable, and yet we do it. And you know, we're one small example of a much broader phenomenon. I mean, what I would tell a young person is like, look, at the end of the day, there are only three arguments for becoming a journalist, okay? One, you have a built-in excuse to walk up to the most interesting people in the world and say, can I ask you a few questions, right? There's no other job where you have a license for curiosity like that, okay? Second, you get to travel around. You have a built-in excuse for just figuring out where something interesting is happening and going and putting yourself in that space, right? And trying to figure out what it's all about. And third, and I think this is the clincher, we are the last profession on earth where we get paid to tell the truth. Now, do we do it all the time? No, but fundamentally, that's what I pay my staff to do. Not to push a corporate line, not to try to sell something, not to try to convince people of anything, but simply to tell people what the hell is going on, right? And that's as true today as it was when I started and when, for that matter, when the printing press was invented. You're going to have to put up with much less security than we used to have in this business, but the other side of that is much greater creativity. But those three constants, they're still there.
Let's take questions from our audience.
So we probably have time for maybe 3 questions, Jack. So the first question is to Father Matt. How can the church do a better job engaging young people who have only known a church riddled with scandal, especially in the parishes?
That's a great question. And you know, I'm not sure that there is an answer that is applicable everywhere and at all times, right? Because I think that the best work that's being done in evangelization is happening in our parishes, and it's happening in a very specific social, political, economic context, right? And all of that has to be taken into account. But all of that being said, I think we know what doesn't work, right? The first is to take seriously the questions that people are asking, of every age, but particularly young people, to take seriously the questions that they're asking, and to listen to those questions, rather than just entering into a encounter with them as if they're waiting for us to give them the answers, right? So when the Pope talks about discernment, when he talks about accompaniment, he's talking about walking beside people in that process of questioning, right? You know, and that I think is crucially important because, look, the fundamental reality of the church is that for us, truth, right? The truth that John talked about, for a journalist, truth is a proposition that corresponds to an objective reality. For Christians, truth is a person, and his name is Jesus Christ, right? And we, therefore, as Pope Benedict said in his interview with Peter Seewald, we never possess the truth. We dare to hope that he possesses us, right? And it's only in that mindset then that our evangelization becomes about encounter rather than confrontation, and accompaniment, right, rather than lording it over people. And you know, if there's a revolution happening under this papacy, it is that the Pope, sometimes in a very messy way, is calling our attention to the fact that our pastoral priorities have to be different. And they have to privilege the personal over the propositional. Because, I mean, otherwise, it's the difficulty is that everyone, but particularly young people, feel as if they're drowning in an ocean of propositions. Everybody has a claim to them, right? But the thing that we can offer is relationship, the relationship that we bear witness to, and to accompany them in exploring their relationship with the one who is the way and the truth and the life.
Thank you. Someone else asked, how can lay people, especially women, become more involved in reforms?
Is that from one of us particularly?
No one in particular, so.
I'm sorry, what was the last part?
Okay, it was how can lay people, especially women, become more involved in reforms?
Go.
Well, for one thing, I think I'm going to be interested to see what the Pope and his commission have to say about the diaconate and what happens there. I think there is evidence to support the admission of women to the ordination to the diaconate. That would certainly help. But the thing is, in the end, you know, we can't solve the problem of clericalism by just clericalizing a whole bunch of other people, right? So I think, you know, the way that women take part in reform is by living the vocation that they have to the church, in whatever station it is, right? With a kind of fearlessness, right? And a kind of holy boldness. You know, by demanding that they have a place in the parish council, that they're in the room when those decisions are made, by claiming the rights and responsibilities that every single baptized person has, right? And this gets back to what I was talking about earlier, of asking ourselves, what is the way in which clericalism prevents us from doing that, right? You know, sometimes I think that the issue is we have a lack of imagination when it comes to our life together as church. Here's an example. I was sent to Guyana when I was a novice. The church in Guyana was founded, well, by Jesus Christ, but by the Jesuits more remotely in 1920. It's not even 100 years old yet. When the Jesuits reached the interior of Guyana, the Guyanese were nomadic and they were polygamists and so forth, and now they're all Catholics. They see their priest once every 6 weeks. They have always seen their priest once every 6 weeks, right? The rest of the time, the church is run by the people in the local villages, and it's a matriarchal society, so that's almost always women, right? Who witness marriages, who bury the dead, who are instructing the children, who are leading Eucharistic adoration, and so forth. Why is that important? Because when I came to Guyana from Boston, where at noon on a Wednesday, if I was standing in City Hall Plaza, I would have a choice of 5 masses within a 10-minute walk of me. Mm-hmm. It comes back to the question is, what do we mean when we say church, right? So I think it's not just a question of women taking their place and claiming their rightful place in the order of the church, but of all of us doing that, and doing it in a way that really engages the imagination that the Holy Spirit has willed us.
Jack, do you mind?
Sure.
Just a quick breaking news alert. Just moments ago, Cardinal George Pell was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He will be eligible to apply for parole after 3.6 years. Of course, remember, Cardinal Pell has a hearing on his appeal of his conviction coming up June 5th and 6th, so we will see. But as of now, Cardinal Pell has become the highest-ranking church official anywhere in the world ever to be sentenced to jail time for the crime of sexual abuse of a minor. My quick take, I think everything Matt just said is absolutely right, but in response to the question, how can lay people and especially women play a greater part in reform? My answer would be by not waiting for an invitation to do so. Like, if we look at how the church has worked over the centuries, the great reforms that Matt was talking about a little bit ago, right? How did we get the great mendicant orders of the 12th and 13th centuries? It's not because somebody in power said, let it be so. It's because creative individuals, Francis and Dominic and others, saw a changing social reality in the new cities that were being born, were taking shape in Europe, and created new apostolic models to respond to it. The great teaching orders of the 19th century that led the church back after the Napoleonic period. Again, nobody in officialdom asked for these things. In fact, usually in their birth pangs, they fought against them tremendously or did everything they could to discourage them. And yet you had charismatic founders, in that case, mostly all women, who created new instruments to revitalize the church's educational mission. The great lay movements of the 20th century, it's the same story in a different key, right? And most of those movements at the time of their foundation were looked upon with great trepidation, and nobody was putting them in the Kennedy directory right out of the gate, right? There's this great winnowing process in the church when these kind of things are born all of the time, and some of them stand the test of time and others don't. But in any event, it's never because officialdom has convened a blue ribbon panel and said, this is what we need. It's because creative individuals at the grassroots simply did something, right? Now, of course, there are certain things that lay people and women in the church cannot do by definition. I mean, they can't start celebrating Mass and so on, but it's actually a fairly short list if you look at it, canonically, what you cannot do. The set of things you can do actually is much, much, much larger. Well, that would be my answer. Don't wait for officialdom to open the door for you. Kick it in.
Yeah.
We're going to end each of the programs for the Easter series with one question. You have 30 seconds to answer it, but it's positive. What's your hope to share? What's your hope to share? John, 30 seconds.
Well, aside from the fact that Matt has already answered this question, because ultimately our hope is in Jesus Christ, and that the church he founded is his work and not ours, fundamentally. My hope would be when I go around the world, I see so many talented, committed, driven, enthusiastic people who, despite everything we've been talking about for the last hour and a half, are making this faith come alive and changing people's lives at the retail level. That's where my hope is.
Father Matt?
Yeah, I would say, in addition to the aforementioned one who is hope, I would say the kind of thing that John was just talking about, kicking in the door, claiming our rightful places in the life of the church, it's happening. Mm-hmm. It's actually happening, right? So you not only, John's absolutely right, don't wait, but there's a lot of people who aren't waiting, right? There are parishes that are being revitalized, and there are pastoral councils that are showing different models of governance, and there are brave pastors who are listening to their parishioners, and they are including people in new and vibrant ways, right? Look, we shouldn't look to our teachers, our bishops, to necessarily lead in this way, because they're charged with conserving, right? Frequently, teachers are the last ones to learn something new.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're certainly grateful for your wisdom tonight. I do want to encourage those of you to visit americamedia.org and sign up for email. Also to visit cruxnow.com, sign up for their emails. You can get them every day. You'll know everything that's happening minute by minute. John, thank you for all you do for our church. It matters greatly. Father Matt, for all you do for our church as well, and for the Society of Jesus, and Jack, for all you do for Boston College. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack.